Good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to our Daniels Faculty Lecture, Architectural Adventures in Mass Media by Lara Lesmes and Fredrik Hellberg of Space Popular. My name is Janice Miyagi, and I'm one of the 9 thesis students who have the privilege of working with Lara and Fredrik this semester. And it's my pleasure to host today's event with my colleagues, Larab, Kasim, and Ben Chang. So first, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Daniels honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to the local elders, including those of the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. Please note that this is being live streamed and recorded. If you do not wish to be captured, please turn off your video. We ask you keep yourself muted throughout the presentation, and you may add your questions in the chat for Ben and Larab to relay, or if you wish to ask your question directly, please put your name in the chat and a note that you wish to ask your question on camera. We're really excited to have Lara and Fredrik here to share their latest projects with us. Founded in Bangkok in 2013, Space Popular is a multidisciplinary design practice whose projects include furniture, interiors, public artworks, installations, and of course, architecture in both the physical and virtual worlds. The firm and our studio here at Daniels is interested in exploring the creation of architecture for the immersive internet, as well as anticipating the fusion of physical and virtual spaces. Lara and Fredrik are both graduates of the Architectural Association School of Architecture, where they also teach a master's studio, and it has been such a pleasure learning from them this year. Please welcome me in joining Lara and Fredrik.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, thank you so much, Janice.
Thank you for the introduction. So without further ado, we're gonna go ahead and get started. So as Janice mentioned, we did found our firm in Bangkok, of all places, which is where we moved pretty much right after graduating after a teaching job at the very young starting program in Chulalongkorn University, which has played an absolutely critical role in shaping our career and our interests as well. Currently, we teach as well at the Architectural Association and Daniels. Today, we're going to be talking about architectural adventures in mass media, which is actually the title of our latest show, which opened in the auspicious date of end of February 2020. It was open for like basically 3 weeks before it had to close. But before we get into that, we can just give you a very, very brief overview of why do we say that our firm is multidisciplinary, even though it's formed by 2 architects. Well, we do work as architects. We recently completed our first self-standing building. We have worked on several interiors, and we have also had the chance to develop furniture collections for usually linked to the interior projects, especially the ones that were built in Bangkok, where the clients had this understanding of basically building a complete work of art. At the same time, while we were in Bangkok, we worked on very many competitions. And although we have our reservations for whether the competition format itself and whether one should be part of them, this was a very important part of shaping our career and giving us an opportunity to create work that then we could reflect upon and basically try and trace back what are those interests, what is the focus of our practice, and clearly elements, just polychromy, ornamentation, intricacy, are probably quite obviously readable throughout. We have also done some more ephemeral works, such as this music stage for the festival Wonderfruit in Thailand, and this mural that you see here on the right-hand side. But the core of our work, or the core of one side of our work in the past 5 years or so, have been exhibitions. Here you see the one that we're going to be talking about more in depth today, Freestyle, at the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects in London, and other shows throughout the past years, such as the Wardian case at the Palazzo Reale in Milano, and Value in the Virtual at Arctes in Sweden, the Glass Chain, which was the first one of this kind. I will explain what this kind is later. And this part of our show in the magazine gallery in Vienna.
And we thought we'd start going a little deeper into this public artwork we had a chance to install at the Doksugung Palace in central Seoul, South Korea in 2019, because it kind of connects quite nicely to our interests in mass media, architecture, and the related issues that Lara spoke about. And for some reason, they allowed us to put this enormous LED screen in the middle of this heritage site, which used actually to be the gate that separated the more public areas of the palace and the emperor's private sleeping chambers. And kind of connected to this is this bigger interest we have in sort of the role of architecture in history and at the moment. So this is one of the frames from the video installation. So if you're standing right in front of it, you would first see the original gate that would have been there. The door is still there, but it doesn't function as a gate anymore, obviously, opening and revealing the view that you would have seen when the palace was in its original state just about 100 years ago. And we're really interested in sort of thinking back at like the role of these sort of architectural elements in the past, and just how important, in this case, like palace gates were gates that separated very, very important places from what was thought as not very important places, and how we don't see these anymore, and largely how in the 21st century, the most important gates separates virtual and physical spaces. So in this video, what you then begin to see as more and more doors open is that they open up basically media portals. So we see all the kind of things from television into television studios, and interfaces such as mobile phones taking in the shape of doorways. And we're generally like really interested in how different kinds of portals or doors have been used in basically the age of mass media, especially in the age of electronic mass media, as these kind of fantastical ideas of things that can bring us into fantastical worlds or teleport us in huge different distances or even through time. And this brings us to the way we are working with media very directly in our practice, and something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. This is a video from our exhibition, the first one where we used virtual reality as a form of media to show virtual reality films or immersive films, and something that we've been doing in almost all of our exhibitions, where basically the human body is in a space full of physical objects that are also part of the virtual experience. You can see Lara there at the bottom reaching out and touching this very physical glass sculpture, but what she's actually seeing is an enhanced virtual version of that. You're kind of interested in this kind of portalness. So we'll just talk a bit briefly about the project called the Venn Room, which depicts a series of sort of speculations on what's going to happen in the future, in an augmented future where basically VR headsets are replaced with augmented reality, and speculating on like thinking about what past media has done to environments such as the home, and the ability to translate these vast differences and distances. And considering like how we think about media today, and again, what will happen when media is literally something we're in rather than something that we watch. So again, like the previous example in this, you could reach out and touch these murals, and there were other elements there in the environment. And basically what the Venn Room speculates on is how our homes will be overlapped in the future when we use augmented reality on our day-to-day lives, just like we're using smartphones today. And speculating on how basically like these endless global homes will be able to be created where your individual home is merged with others. And we thought we would watch this film together. It's about 4 minutes long.
Welcome to The Van Room, a film exploring the future of virtual togetherness in the home.
The telephone is one of the first devices that made virtual togetherness possible. By transporting our voices to places our bodies cannot reach, it shortens the distance between us. Together with the voices came the background noises of that other invisible place, bringing a bit of the atmosphere from the other end of the line and temporarily merging it with yours. The telephone is, in this way, a portal into other worlds.
The television, as the radio, opened up new portals to other places from within the home, allowing us to share significant moments with millions of strangers. When we watch the moon landing or our favorite cooking show, it is as if we are all sitting together in one giant living room.
Soon the personal computer would give us access to new forms of virtual togetherness through the video call, where we could not only hear and see each other, but also catch glimpses of each other's homes, like a bookshelf in the background or the pillow under your head.
Today, virtual reality can bring our body into the world within the screen. But in the future, new virtual devices will instead bring virtual worlds directly into our homes. When we gather virtually, we merge our homes with one another. From this overlay, a new space emerges, a hybrid of the two, a new shared van room.
Here is an apartment. It has 3 rooms containing familiar furniture and objects. A table with 4 chairs, a sideboard and a large cabinet with a stereo, 2 small tables and some drapes, a floor lamp and an old stove, 2 armchairs, a coffee table and an old telephone, a little sideboard with a television on it, and a lamp hanging from the ceiling.
In an augmented future, a virtual visitor would bring their surroundings along with them. Your home and theirs will overlap, and together you will rearrange the furniture so that you get to sit next to each other on the couch or cook dinner together.
Some of the overlaps might become meaningful, and you may virtually decorate or highlight them to remember the new hybrid home you share. We may keep some of them for just a day, others will become more significant, and we will keep them for years. The virtual blending of everyday lives will create new types of mixed rooms. We may sit next to each other, yet you may be outside in the garden while I'm inside watching TV. You may end up brushing your teeth in my kitchen as it blends with your bathroom counter.
From the footprint of our homes combined, we will form a shared virtual one, full of hybrid rooms, full of van rooms, where our domestic lives would play out with strange misalignments and glitches, fundamentally changing our domestic rituals, our sense of privacy, and our social norms. We may have numerous van rooms and choose to share them with few or with many, either way becoming a small part of an immeasurable and ever-shifting global home.
We are, however, not the first architects to think about the virtual house or the virtual house itself. It is quite interesting to note that in 1997, or like over 20 years before we were working on this project, any magazine, part of any corporation, developed this number where they called for designs for the virtual house. And the people participating in this competition were no less than Toyoito, Daniel Libeskind, Zaira Polo, Herzog and de Meuron, or even Eisenman as well. But of course, what they proposed and what they were concerned with when developing or like thinking about the virtual home was pretty much philosophical, except for the Herzog and de Meuron proposal that is very interesting. I'm not going to elaborate on it, but you can have a look. It's the one at the bottom right. Because back then, VR technology had not yet arrived fully to the home. We are at a moment today where companies like HTC Vive are suggesting our living room layouts. These are literal screenshots from HTC help on how to arrange your living room. Or here is one of our favorite memes ever from the Facebook group Virtual Reality on how people who has headsets thinks about their virtual house. So this is not to be taken lightly. And what we find interesting about this is that it's not architecture necessarily shaping behavior, changing the way we live. It's just us changing the way we live, and as architects perhaps observing that and realizing how a house should maybe soon be done differently by observing these behaviors. This is the first house we built, and interestingly, it was for no client. It was for a developer, and it was thought of as almost like a prototype for a construction system that could then be developed forward. So we haven't embedded much of that media thinking in it yet, as we think that there is perhaps yet not enough observation in order to implement new home layouts based on the changes in media. The focus in this home is on one of the other big interests of our firm, which is construction systems. The house consists of two systems that come together in perhaps a bit of an unorthodox way, which is a sort of scaffold-like metal structure and a very traditional from the Mediterranean in Spain brick vault system. This brick vault system was developed by Rafael, was commercialized and expanded on by Rafael Guastavino. It existed since there is proof that it was already in place since the 14th century. But Guastavino, as you see here in one of his advertisements, basically developed this system much further with many more options, and more importantly, took it into the United States, where he built with this incredibly efficient method many of the most incredible domes, such as this vaulted ceiling in the Boston City Library. Also important of his development was the addition of all of these possibilities for patterns with glazed bricks. And here you see some of the photographs in construction and a bit of a video where you see how the magic happens. The magic of this system is that it relies on the craftsman understanding the level of dryness of the mortar and not needing any scaffolding, because as they put the brick sticks, and the vault is self-supporting at every stage. What this means is that we didn't need any additional scaffolding, but actually the metal structure of the house became the scaffolding for the brick craftsmen to build on. And we have been in the past years also developing other systems, sometimes in collaboration with clients like the one before, and sometimes in collaboration directly with the industry. This was us working with the very large Swedish wood company Setra, where we were figuring out a way of creating a construction system that would link products that they could develop, the industry manufacturers, that tap directly to a sort of DIY culture. For this particular one, and similarly to the brick vault house, we developed a whole array of possibilities. So we're not particularly interested in prefab houses, but we're interested in the idea of developing a system that then is flexible enough for people to develop different types of houses around it. And again, this is also how we thought of the brick vault house. Here you see the plans that are developed completely modular. This is not necessarily because it comes in modules from the factory, but because if you have this modular system, it will be much easier. But you have all of the details solved, and then also a lot of the calculations are applicable because you are always dealing with the same volumes. So here you see some of the photographs of how that space frame grows outside of the building, how the inside and the outside take this connection of the inside and the outside takes advantage of the Mediterranean climate. And here we are pretending that if only we could live there, which we didn't get to.
So as Lara said, as a house is very conventionally designed. We do use real-time engines and VR in design as well, but it doesn't necessarily have any implications on the design of the house. Or here in this picture, we are really interested in how someone might use it. And this is coming back to the Venn room again, something that we are extremely interested in private spaces, how augmented reality and how VR at the moment is already changing, but is going to change issues of decoration and issues of meaning and symbolism in private spaces, such as this view from the Venn room, and you see these kind of strange virtual patterns growing on the wall. But we've also spent a lot of time thinking about how augmented reality and virtual spaces will affect the city and public spaces, especially in this project called Value in the Virtual at Arctis in Stockholm, which is a solo show curated by James Taylor Foster, which occupies a large gallery, which is quite newly built at Arctis, featuring these very simple scaffoldings and these super, super thin fabric murals depicting spaces that we'll explain a bit more in detail. And this also connects with another project and just our interest in the power of virtual surfaces, be they digital, virtual, digital, electronic, or not. And this is an amazing example of a 17th century tapestry, which is in the Palazzo Reale in Milan, depicting Jason chasing the golden fleece with his Argonauts. And we had the amazing opportunity, you can see that very same tapestry on the right-hand side there, to create an installation in this room, just again to mention, like here we created this sense that there's a reflection, but it's actually 3D printed fabric.
Not printed, not 3D.
Yeah, not 3D printed, just printed fabric, Alcantara specifically. And we are really interested in how like the thinness of a virtual surface can have incredible implications. So in this project, going back to the Value in the Virtual, we were speculating on what will happen to environments such as this, it's a gate into a park or a shopping area, specifically in Stockholm. And we decided to select a few kind of stand-in or generic environments from Stockholm to arrange in these murals, created a carpet, which is a sort of map, this huge digitally printed carpet, where the center is the kind of 100% virtuality, and it sort of disperses from there. And we were interested in considering what is the value of virtual architecture and how can we consider that in a public space. And we realized in order to do that, we need to understand a little bit of what the value of physical architecture is. So we made this kind of very simple list of the basic values of physical architecture, and they then sort of take place in these murals. Here is a beautiful physical concrete sandblasted artwork that in our vision here becomes three-dimensional through augmented reality. And obviously, if it's virtual and all the values are completely different, and we realize that it's only really these three values that translate into the virtual: comfort, meaning, and aesthetics. All of the other ones, like scale and location, they don't really apply in the virtual. So we then created this kind of all these murals depicting, here we see the home, imagining that our communication that's happening live at the speed of the spoken word would start to take shape into our wallpapers and into our architecture. We're imagining that things like this, the view of one of the most important rooms in all of Sweden, the Golden Hall, where the Nobel Prize dinner is always held every year, imagining that the motifs could change by the day, depicting things like gaming, Minecraft, or VR, Wi-Fi symbols, or other things that we might want to celebrate on a shorter basis. And all coming together in here, I've done the view from the exhibition, where in the center we see a VR headset. We'll explain in a second what that means. Another view from a cafe, we see these crypto kittens kind of taking shape through the very typical hipster tiling of the walls. And coming back again to the headset here, and sort of the one interesting thing that we experimented here that we tried in other exhibitions as well, and we're working also with our students here at Daniels and at the AA. In that headset, you could access a virtual version which was actually linked to a social VR platform that connected to a platform where we could actually join the space through an avatar. It's Lara, you see there at the bottom. and interact with the visitors to the museum remotely. And this is where we're connecting to this sort of bigger interest of mass media and our interest in the relationship of mass media in architecture, but maybe specifically more and more in specifically around this exhibition, Freestyle, around the interest of style in architecture. And connecting again with our speculations that we brought up from the Venn room, this is something that we definitely think will happen, that by the middle of the 21st century, basically in 30 years or so, all media will be spatial, meaning that there will be no more screens. There will be no smartphones, tablets, or laptops. And all of the virtual stuff we interact with on a daily basis will be spatial and architectural. Similar to what we explored again in the Venn room. And the question here that we are really preoccupied with is what immersive media such as the AR will do to architectural style in the future. Such as, again, we saw in Value in the Virtual. And again, these interests of like what will happen when architecture is at the speed of the spoken word with AI and AR. We believe that basically as quickly as you can think of architectural spaces, they will manifest in front of us. So what will that do to style? And connecting then to the exhibition Freestyle, which we worked on for just over 2 years with the curator Shumi Bose. The RIBA in London is incredible because it has an incredible archive, and they have a series of exhibitions where they ask architects to react to things in their archive. And the thing that was brought to us was this incredible book by Sebastiano Sergio, and specifically book volume 4, which was the first one published in the middle of the 16th century, roughly on style. And what's so important with this book, you can see all the ones that he published here, 1537, the volume 4 was published, which is again the first one that was published, is that this book was the first book and essentially the first mass media object ever that represented architecture visually. Before then, you had to get your hands on a woodblock print, which is very rare, or a painting, or a manuscript, and basically like it was almost impossible. So we started with getting this book as a sort of introduction to thinking about style and as a starting point of the brief, thinking about the context of Europe at the time where this book was published. And at the time when Renaissance architecture was in vogue, but that was only really built around this area of Italy. And again, what did mass media objects do to architectural style being the kind of main question? And we used this book quite a lot, which is by Mario Carpo, published in the mid-90s, on architecture in the age of printing, where he describes Renaissance architecture as the first style that was kind of intentionally meant to be imitated. And that's the sort of ethos of these books, like Sergio's book. And again, thinking about the context at the time of the mass media sort of reality, that if you wanted to be inspired by a building, you had to see it in person. That was the only way. You could not experience it in the distance. And this amazing quote from him, buildings could not travel, so people had to, which of course is incredibly different today. So thinking about this context of the printing press that gave access to architectural samples without having to travel. And it's difficult to kind of put our mind to just how revolutionary this was, and that the book was essentially a vehicle for buildings to travel in, which seems kind of difficult to imagine today. But of course, then we started to think about what about other mass media devices and how do they affect style, and how did buildings and the style of buildings travel in other forms of mass media? And this became a sort of bigger question of the exhibition at large. And then we started to think about this hypothesis of what is the correlation between innovations in media and the development of architectural style.
So if we place ourselves at the present, we can see that architectural style travels at great speeds through the waters of the internet. And for the exhibition itself, we wanted to cover a really, really wide range of time that went from the printing press to the near future. This was important because we wanted to deal with quantity in order to be able to identify patterns. These are the different areas in which we structure our research. which were mass media hardware, literally the devices that were being used, software, the architectural styles themselves, and then research on the architects, what they built, what they did, what they read, who they read, and the buildings themselves, so looking at the formal manifestation. The way this happened was very unglamorously by spending a lot of time in the archives and basically like trying to bring everything into spreadsheets to try and start visualizing where we could identify anomalies or moments in these patterns, and where there were interesting things to bring out. However, I must say that like we have all that we were doing was utilizing the RIBA archive. A very different kind of project of this kind would be dealing with verbal histories, which that would be the greatest endeavor, I guess. But the way in which all this information manifested in space was basically by turning the room into a diagram that manifested through a printed carpet, a model, some of the collection objects, and all of this arranged according to time. So the whole room is organized according to a timeline. Sorry, I got a bit stuck.
Yeah, sorry, our slideshow just got.
Do you want to stop share and reshare?
Yeah, we'll try that. Thanks.
Thank you. That's coming.
Looks good.
Good. So as I was saying, the whole room is organized according to time, where every year is 1 centimeter. So wherever you position yourself, you can understand where you are in this timeline. And there you see that the big changes in color in the carpet are according to the changes in style, although these styles obviously merge into one another quite a lot, but we agreed on a certain moment where there was a significant shift so that this would be to communicate this clearly. And we see how styles accelerate as we move forward in time. So these strips become narrower and narrower. This is another layer of information overlaid on the carpet, which is like figurative representations of the hardware itself, from the printing press on one side to the smartphone on the other, in the two main elements, to a whole array of all kinds of weird inventions for forms of visualization, but also forms of printing and distribution. And the film itself is organized in 4 acts that are distributed across the room, on which particular examples are taken out and a story is told through specific examples.
So again, with this core of trying to find or articulate the correlations between innovation in the media and the development of architectural style. So going back again to this map of the room over this model. So this film, all in all, is the longest immersive film we've ever worked on, half an hour roughly, in 4 acts. And they then cover from the moment when Serlio's book arrives in England up until the middle of the 21st century. So here we see one of the few lucky chaps that got to experience this before it actually closed. It's still there, actually. It's going to reopen, but it's been closed now almost for a year. So as that person is standing there, this is what they would actually see. So you're first introduced to Serlio by this tiny little avatar, or this little host, which is the narrator that takes you through some of the most important examples in English architectural history, where it's very clear that Serlio's book was literally copied, and the first examples of Renaissance architecture in the UK, and the kind of pattern books that then later started coming from Holland and from other parts of Europe, leading to these kind of things. Anyone who's been to London has probably seen St. Paul's Cathedral by Sir Christopher Wren. And we won't go into detail, but this is a really interesting example, because Sir Christopher Wren, he built over 50 churches in central London after the Great Fire of London, and most of them in the Baroque style, inspired by buildings that he never saw. He only left the island once to go to Paris, and all of his work basically relied on mass media coming to him in the form of books. He had a vast, enormous library. And then Act 2, so you take off your headset, you put on the other one, covers other more important books that started coming into the UK. You can see the host again there on the bottom right corner. And then we had examples like this, the original drawing in the exhibition, where architectural styles started to be openly copied, and where new entire styles, such as Palladialism, which obviously then translated very directly into North America much, much later through Jefferson and others. And then we introduced the issues with colonialism and how other kinds of interest much further afield started coming back to the UK with colonialism, and then moving forward with interests that come up with new innovations in printing, with color, with the grammar of ornament. And also then, as you're watching this, you can look down on the carpet to see what kind of strange, super kind of odd media hardware started coming about at the time, such as here, the Stereograph, the first kind of VR headset, and the Zootrope that was very popular in the court of Queen Victoria during the Great Exhibition, and the camera, of course, and the kind of styles that gave rise to. And then moving into the 20th century in Act 3, we're introduced to the cinema. And here we see an example of how the model itself shifts scale as you're later introduced to the television, which is the scale of view versus what we just saw. And the kind of spaces, again, that television made available through great distances, such as the television studio, and how that started informing the transfer of styles in a much more rapid way. And then very quickly moving to these kind of innovations, such as video games and all of the environments that projected into the home.
What becomes interesting at this moment is that we start being introduced to the pattern book, and mainly through the making of architectural environments for gaming. So we start seeing these new menus of all kinds of architectural elements that all fit within a particular style, and therefore they become like a building system. And they have a style, and they have styles that we don't necessarily have words for, because we don't need to, because we can see them, right? Because we have a pool of samples large enough to put into images that which we cannot or don't necessarily need to put into words. And this takes us to the fourth act that deals with this idea of what happens, or what even is this notion of architecture at the speed of the spoken word. So looking back onto the whole timeline, you see the accumulation of media hardware, and reaching to this moment where perhaps the hardware is less important, and it's more about what the hardware can do and what the hardware gives you access to, which is things like Pinterest being maybe the epitome, like the one of the greatest examples of how we can deal with images as a language and literally understand one another. When you click on more like this, what is Pinterest doing is trying to depict, is trying to understand your language. And this is what we think that could be possible when, instead of sharing images, we are sharing 3D assets at the same speed. So you find yourself towards the end of this fourth act in a moment where 3D assets are shared with the same fluency as we now can share images, and therefore style becomes actual information and actual exchange, actual communication. Media speeds up, and architecture becomes available at the speed of the spoken word.
And just to kind of conclude, we are very interested in immersive media also in our current age, and we do a lot of work in these worlds called social VR platforms. You see a screenshot where every single person is actually wearing a headset, they're operating an avatar, and they're actually embedded in media, much in the same way that we speculate will happen in the future. Very small group of people are currently using this. Here's some student work from a few years ago using Sansar. And again, Sansar was also used in the exhibition Value in the Virtual in 2018. And one of the most important aspects of the show Freestyle are these screens that are depicting work that was done in Mozilla Hubs, which is a platform we're working with in the studio at Daniels as well, where we were working with a group of students between the ages of 15 and 17, where we wanted to see like how much can be created with these younger students and what kind of issues of style can come up if we work with a platform such as Mozilla Hubs and teach them how to use it only within the range of about 2 hours. And they created the most phenomenal spaces that then are actually a big part of the exhibition itself.
Just coming back to a quote from Mario Carta that we brought up earlier, buildings could not travel, so people had to, this is a good introduction to what happened to our practice in a way and our way of thinking about how to make virtual worlds available in 2020, no? Q2020, people cannot travel, so buildings had to. And this was, it slapped us on the face very early on. Oh no, it happened again. Well, you missed that, which is maybe the best slide of the whole presentation, which is my niece's birthday in Mozilla Hubs. And yeah, where we realized that like, well, what we thought before that was really great because we were bringing into cultural spaces and technology that people otherwise couldn't experience and giving them access to that technology and giving them access to ideas about how that technology might change our life. We thought that that was a great mission. Then everything is closed and we started realizing that, well, we need to bring people in through their own devices. So here is one of the spaces that we started to build for the kids, for our nephew and niece, who then demanded places to play hide and seek and whatnot. And those experiments led to then other types of spaces, such as this gallery for the Architectural Association, spaces for debate, and sort of culminated in a larger project in the past October, where we were asked by curator Gonzalo Herrero Delicado to build a virtual version of this event that takes place every year in a different city in Spain, which is Arquia Proxima Festival. This was, of course, a huge challenge because what is happening in this space is not just that panel discussion in the middle that you could move into a Zoom call. What is happening is that all the people sitting around is a new generation of Spanish and Portuguese young architects that create true bonds and then help one another throughout their careers. So the accidental encounters, the little conversation chit chats in the corner were crucial. And then, of course, there was the lectures. But Peter Cook here lecturing on the big screen was as important or even less than the meetings and the friendships that were being formed in this big square, in this large public environment and in the corridors of the exhibition halls that we created. This came after we also had to move the exhibition itself, for style, that closed 3 weeks after being open, into an accessible and fair and safe online platform.
So this is where we will round off on this strange kind of almost forced overlap, despite our interests in the future of the virtual spaces, that our exhibition about virtual spaces, which is physical, was forced to become virtual.
So you make all the effort to translate all these ideas about virtual space into a physical environment, and then you have to take that physical environment back into a virtual space. That's definitely loopy.
Yeah, so here we are at the vernissage with curator Shimi Bose and journalist Ollie Wainwright. But curiously enough, obviously there's something that's really interesting to say about this, despite the fact that the virtual version is obviously much less than the physical one. This is open 24 hours a day and to anyone from all over the world, which opens up the conversation we think about what are we really doing in this age during lockdown, when we are now in Spain. We can give a lecture in wherever you are in the world. So this exhibition is actually currently still open, and we can share a link. We've been there with all of our students at Daniel's, and you can go whenever you want. And on that note, we thank you very much for this opportunity, and it's been great. Thank you so much.
I want to start off by saying thank you so much for that talk. It was really fascinating to learn about all the ways in which our physical world and our virtual world can come together and how fast approaching this is within the near future as well. So my question for you guys is that when we think about virtual reality or a space designed within a virtual world, the possibilities really seem endless. There's no limitations about things like gravity, and really things can be repeated endlessly with just a few clicks. And the result of that is that it sort of like heightens the user experience, and we get to witness these beautifully designed spaces, many like the ones that you guys have shown us today. So I'm wondering, in your past works, what were some of the limitations that you have experienced when you were designing a virtual space in combination with a physical space?
That's a really interesting question. It's something we end up spending a lot of time thinking about and talking about, which is the sort of the role of references, or the role of, you could even say, mimicry or imitation, to borrow Mario Carp's term from Renaissance architecture, within virtual spaces. And we think that it relates to the fact that in a virtual environment, every single thing you can experience is language, it is information, because as you said, nothing really has to be in there, right? So everything you put in there is there to communicate something to you. And the most meaningful virtual spaces, in our opinion, are the ones that can be used by people, where architecture serves a similar kind of role as it does in physical reality, which is it being peripheral, right? It's not like the actual focus of a social interaction, whichever room you're in, right? It's always surrounding the thing to happen, which is usually not architecture itself, right? So for that to be possible, like the architecture needs to set certain meaningful contexts, and the only way to do that is to use the existing semiotic library we have from physical architecture. It's like, I think one really good reference here is just imagine all of the animated films, like hand animated or 3D animated, that also have the possibility to be anything. That doesn't need to be any gravity. Like, why do they all have characters in them? Why is up this? Because otherwise you cannot build any meaning out of them, right? And who would sit through 2 hours of pure abstraction, right? Similarly, who would actually go into a virtual world of pure abstraction, where nothing makes any sense, there's no up, there's no down. So just the fact of like creating bodies, avatars, is the first step. Then we have gravity, then we have things like affordances that we're used to using, door handles, chairs, all of these things that form meaning in a peripheral way to whatever we choose to do in there. So we find that the more referential it is, the more useful it is actually, and the more impactful it can be experientially, and
the more immersive.
And the more immersive, yeah. But it's like, and I think also one interesting reference to make is obviously the sort of our huge inspiration to us is the formerly Toronto-based philosopher Marshall McLuhan, who speaks about the rear view mirror and the fact that you cannot use a new medium in a new way. It's not just that it's difficult, it's literally that it's impossible. We can only fill the new medium with the old stuff. And that's what's happening now. There's a kind of skeuomorphic thing going on where we're mimicking physical reality and virtual reality. Probably in 50 or 100 years, when generations of people have lived big parts of their lives in virtual spaces, it will become self-referential. And
so in a way, the biggest challenge is to not try to do new things, but to try to do maybe old things in a new way. And it's similar in how we were talking about the design of the house. And I think a lot of people was asking us, oh, well, is it a house because you work so much with VR? It's going to be a house that is designed for like a future of the augmented world. So it's like, no, because I have no idea how people will want their homes then, and who am I to dictate that? So I think throughout all of our work has been this realization of like, you wait and observe instead of trying to, I would say, almost impose while we think we propose, perhaps, and to hold back on that has been biggest lesson and challenge.
Thanks.
Great, thank you, Lara and Fredrik. We have a question from the chat. It's asking, it says, great work. Do your designs allow interaction or can be manipulated by the audience?
Yeah, so here is the big difference from the work that we were doing pre-March 2020, where it was all usually immersive films. In there, the important part was for us to convey ideas to an audience that would come to a gallery or a museum. And that was very directed, right? So there was no interaction per se. I mean, you were a member of the audience and you were put within the environment, which of course creates a whole new kind of experience. But you were not necessarily altering that story. You were listening to these little guides, right? And then after that, when we started creating these platforms that were much more directed towards gathering, because that's very important. These immersive films in the in museums and gallery spaces, they were really individual experiences. And then when we moved on to working as well with social VR platforms accessible from any device and to be accessible from the home, those are actually places where you can interact, meaning like you can talk to other people. Some of the play spaces we built for kids that you can actually manipulate some of the stuff as well. And well, so you can make some small manipulations and draw on them. But we're building now other worlds that have even more, and we are being asked now by clients for more and more sort of gamification of these spaces, which is a whole new thing we didn't think we would be doing, and that we're still trying to figure out what does that actually mean for the work of an architect to start having this whole gamified type of space.
And what would it mean if everything can be manipulated? All the architecture can be manipulated. It's a world that we're usually not used to living in, right? Where like even an architect have very little implications on what the architecture around us can do.
Yeah, I think the question about the role of the architect in this increasingly dematerialized world of virtual reality, I wonder if you could speak to like what is the role of the contemporary architect and whether there is this fear that we will lose touch with reality, and whether this designing of spatial environment helps us create this framework to stay perhaps grounded in something that we know.
I always have a very easy answer to that. That is the moment that we lose touch with the physical realm, then we are not creating virtual environments anymore. We're creating environments that are, then it's the thing, it's not virtual anymore, right? So the fact that we are understanding it as virtual immediately means that is a version of something else in its essence, but not in its entirety. And so that I think it's very important that for these audio-visual experiences we have to be immersive and to even actually have any meaning, they need to be totally attached to our experience of the physical realm. So the issue would be if we reduce or if we would lack our library of physical experiences, no, our incredibly rich haptic library, and that's when basically I think we wouldn't even know what to do in virtual space, because there wouldn't even be a virtual space as such. And the role of the architect here, I think it's, to me, is pretty much exactly the same as the role of the architect in the physical realm, which is to shape enclosures, to shape spaces for people to come together or for people to utilize in other ways that fit their needs and purposes, and that possibly inspire them in certain ways.
But obviously it's incredibly disruptive, and this might be more disruptive than many other things that have happened to architects in the past. Of course, I think what freestyle really taught us is, and something that's obvious, but something difficult to think about, just how many huge shifts and changes there has been in the craft and the practice of making buildings. One very clear thing was just the fact that after the formation of the RIBA, which is the Royal Institute of British Architects, that basically gives out licenses and everything, and basically when the profession was formed for the first time formally in the UK, all women architects disappeared. And before then, you can find many women architects that were actually building in the UK. But after it was standardized, that's a real disruption, because then they were not legally allowed to build.
They were not allowed to have a profession, and therefore they could not be registered. Therefore, so anyway, when we
so just that's obviously not technological in that sense, but there will be, and I think people and architects are ready for this, but architects take a long time to learn the tools and integrate tools into their practices. Like drawing on a computer was incredibly disruptive. Obviously, like in the long run, it ended up being, I think, very beneficial. But in this case, it's not just a creative tool, but it's a tool that will change how we use architecture. And there will certainly be changes in the terms of just, there will be more commissions instead of like rebuilding buildings to have a new visual appeal. The visual appeal might be completely virtual through AR glasses. But having said that, there might be architectural commissions every month instead of every 50 years. So there will be huge changes, and we will all need to be very flexible if we're going to keep our profession somewhat stable.
Thank you so much. The next question comes in from Ted in the chat, who is curious about your exploration of ornament, color, and detail and storytelling elements, not unlike stained glass windows, which were among the sources of inspiration for McLuhan, who studied medieval history.
Yeah, so it's not so much of a question, I think, but it's a really interesting observation, Ted. And I think it's also interesting to see that McLuhan, he was a Joyce scholar. He was not initially trained to think about media in that revolutionary way that he did. But like, I think one thing that starting to read McLuhan when we were students and thinking more and more about it about his work when developing our interest around media and architecture, started to realize that his whole basically foundation is historical. His earlier books were looking way past or before the development of television, which is of course his kind of what he's really famous for. And I think that's also sort of why we really benefit from just generally in our thinking, but also just think it's incredibly important in this moment when there's going to be such huge changes to not think about our time at this moment as being some kind of stable situation. We haven't been in a stable situation for thousands of years technologically, and when it comes to representation generally. I mean, just McLuhan speaks about the kind of huge shifts technologically when alphabets were invented, the spoken word generally as being maybe even more revolutionary.
But to talk about the specifically color, ornamentation, and intricacy, we I mean, to be very fair, we intuitively, even like in our work as students, had a very strong attraction for those spaces, and more through looking at it from this angle of media and communication, like literal communication, not like some elitist architectural language. So to realize that there is something in that attraction comes down to the amount of expression that you find in buildings that make use of polychromy and ornamentation and detail and intricacy, and that visiting buildings that had that versus those that didn't provided a completely different experience. I mean, sometimes you visit buildings that are really skinned of ornamentation that are really not intricate, and then they create a completely different sensation. They can be very awe-inspiring, or they can feel almost sacred in another way. But somehow, and also like we have to give it to our years in Thailand, and we developed this very strong interest to this amount and this quantity that we could create, and that we observed in spaces that made use of polychromy and intricacy. And then placing that and looking at the whole history of the use of color, we also find quite interesting that the rejection of color in architecture comes from an almost elitist standpoint. Color is rejected as being seen as something commonplace at a certain point, and that leads to well, some of the buildings that we see in the late modern movement, because the early modern buildings made an absolutely wonderful use of color. So I always bring up here the book Chromophobia by David Batchelor, which is a wonderful reading that will take you through the history of the rejection of color in art, but more so in architecture.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Lara and Fredrik, for your lecture. And I always love hearing your perspectives on the future of the profession. To see or register for any of the Daniels faculty events this year, just head to the news and events page on the Daniels faculty website. The next event in the Daniels Faculty Talks series is the second lecture by our 2020-2021 Frank Gehry International Visiting Chair in Architectural Design, Douglas Cardinal. This event, Douglas Cardinal in Conversation with Arthur Dyson, is coming up next Thursday, February 4th at 6:30 Eastern. And the next Daniels Faculty Lecture is Methodic Optimism by Philip Magalhaes, Ana Luisa Suarez, and Amit Belkoja of Fala Atelier, who will be next Friday, February 5th at 1 p.m. Eastern, same time as this one today. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you all online again soon. Have a wonderful day.
Great. Thank you so much for having us. And thanks, Janice, Ben, and Larry. See you next week.